I'm Max Keiser. Welcome back to On the Edge. Let's go right to Georgia and speak with Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Dr. Roberts is the former associate editor of the Wall Street Journal and columnist for Business Week. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy during the Reagan administration. Dr. Roberts, welcome back to On the Edge.
Thank you, Max.
All right, Dr. Roberts, I see you're writing in the Trends Journal these days, and you've got a piece up there now, the Swiss franc and the developing crisis. You write that, quote, austerity and money creation add up to what appears to be a contradiction. Inflationary depression. Lots to talk about here. Take it away, Dr. Roberts.
Though everyone focuses on the financial crisis and the banks, but the real crisis, at least for the United States, is the offshoring of jobs for the last 15 years or more, and that has eroded the middle class. And not having much of a middle class left, only a rump, we have a depression in consumer purchasing power. And with all the firms that have moved offshore, we have a depression in state and local tax revenues. So there's a serious economic problem, and it's the reason the unemployment rate does not respond to the easy money and to the stimulus programs and to the federal deficits. All of this is supposed to be, Keynesian post-war demand management to bring the economy back from unemployment. But we've had now several years of it, and it's not worked. And that's the reason. There's no jobs to call the people back to. They've all been moved offshore, or enough of them have. So that's the underlying problem. And on top of that, then, we have the huge trade deficit and the huge budget deficit. And these put pressure on the United States dollar, so that the dollar has been dropping in exchange value. And this then brings inflation into the country through the exchange rate. And, of course, the Federal Reserve's so-called quantitative easing, this is printing money to buy U.S. government bonds, essentially to finance the massive deficit that can't otherwise be financed. And if this money was finding its way into the economy, rather than hanging up in the banks, we would already be experiencing very high inflation. Now, sooner or later, this money will get loose somehow, so that as long as the United States faces a $1.5 trillion budget deficit, in fact, this will rise as the economy fails, continues to decline, because the budget forecasts are based on positive economic growth that doesn't seem to be taking place. So we'll soon have a $1.7 trillion deficit, maybe a $2 trillion deficit. And the only way they can deal with this is to create new money, so that you have a situation where money pours into the economy, but there's no way to put the people back to work, because the manufacturing jobs, the professional skills, software, engineering, IT, those type of things have been moved offshore. So then you have the inflationary depression, for which there's no known economic policy treatment.
All right, so this term that's coming up now more and more, something that you cite Michael Hudson as mentioning, financialized neo-feudalism, going back to the Middle Ages, going back to feudalism, going back to this huge, vast gap between the top 1% and everybody else. So is this inflationary depression feeding into this neo-feudalist model?
Well, this is something else. This is a social development in which wealth is being reconcentrated at the very top, as it was in feudalism. And what Michael Hudson is talking about, as best I understand it, is that the financial sector is increasingly able to appropriate the entire surplus out of the economy. It does it through fees, interest, profits, and it's just draining the lifeblood out of every other kind of economic activity and feeding upon it. You know, Matt Taibbi may have captured this in the image of words, you know, a giant squid wrapped around the face of humanity.
The giant vampire squid of Goldman Sachs.
Yeah, but you can apply it to the entire financial sector. So that is another, it's kind of like a social consequence.
You just said that there is no known prescription for this type of situation. What do you mean by that? I mean, presumably every economic scenario has some counter-economic scenario to address it. How can it have absolutely no known prescription whatsoever?
Well, there's no policy tool. No. Actually, I got this term from John Williams of shadowstats.com. He's been going on about it for a number of years. You see, if you've got depression, the solution has always been to goose the money supply, to restore a diminished supply of money so that it will be sufficient to support full employment. But if you have inflation at the same time, then you're not having a diminished supply of money. And therefore, adding more money to a high inflation is unlikely to have any effect on the unemployment. Whereas if you tried to deal with the inflationary side of the inflationary depression and curtail the money supply to get the prices down, but you've already got high unemployment, you just would tend to throw more people out. So there's no known way of dealing with an inflationary depression, because whichever policy you applied to one would worsen the other.
Is it wrong to make the following analogy, Dr. Roberts? If I live in a town and the plumbing of the main water breaks and it floods the town, and my solution to that problem is to rearrange the liquid soap and my tea towel on my kitchen sink instead of addressing the fact that the main line water system is cracked and broken. If we apply this to the financial markets and the global system, it seems that the interconnectivity of the global banking system has shattered. It's leaking money. That's the inflation part. It's just spewing cash. But the administration and the policymakers are addressing the absolute most facile and superficial aspect of this huge structural, systemic banking collapse. Is that unfair to say?
Well, I think you're onto something. The way I would put it, I think, is that the governments, under the power of the financial sector, are doing everything they can to prevent any losses to the financial sector. And then that requires them to create more debt and more money in order to prevent the financial sector from taking any losses. And that's what we see in the EU right now. You see, the European Central Bank has violated its own charter, the laws governing it, and is printing euros in order to save the German, French, and Dutch bankers from losses on their Greek, Spanish, Italian bonds. So what you see is when you prevent the debt from adjusting, in other words, instead of letting these over-indebted governments restructure their debts down to the level that they can pay, which would mean the banks would take a haircut, they're creating more money and more debt to prevent the banks losing anything. So the problem gets worse. If the Greeks and the Italians and the Spanish can't pay the existing debt, they're not going to be able to pay the new debt on top of that. So this type of approach simply worsens the problem. It's like if somebody's ingesting arsenic and has gotten sick, you decide to give them more arsenic.
Right. Now, you're bringing this back to the European debt crisis, and you mentioned the ECB is now really abdicated its mandate and is now joining the camp of print. And to get back to what we talked about at the top of the show, in Switzerland, the Swiss franc, of course, has inherited a lot of money fleeing the instability of the ECB. And now the Swiss franc is jumping in value, which, of course, is jeopardizing the Swiss economy. So you've got this playing out in the Swiss economy with the Swiss franc. And so can you talk a little bit about what's going on there?
Yes. People seeking a safe haven left dollars and euros and went into the Swiss franc. And the Swiss franc appreciated so much. I mean, it was a tremendous appreciation in a very short time that it threatens their exports. And I believe that it's true that the Swiss economy, half or possibly a little over half of the Swiss economy comes from exports. So people fleeing the dollar and the euro because of the irresponsible money-creating policies there, seeking refuge in the franc, created a crisis for Switzerland. Their franc went up so much in value that their exports were threatened. And so what this forced the Swiss government to do was to inflate. The Swiss government, the Swiss National Bank, had to start printing new francs to absorb the inflows of foreign currencies to prevent the franc from rising. And they've now stabilized the franc around $1 equals 80 Swiss centimes. It was down as low as 72 Swiss centimes to $1. And it used to be like 1.2 francs to a dollar. So what the Swiss are having to do to prevent the rise in the currency is to inflate their own currency. So this is what I think Vladimir Putin, the Russian prime minister, means when he says the United States is a parasite upon the world.
Right. So the money printing that the U.S. does in a system where the banking industry is fundamentally flawed and broken, and none of that money is gaining any traction. It's just paying some corrupt insider bankers. This is having global consequences and could very well lead up to global conflict, and we're already seeing tensions rise globally. Now, you mentioned that the programs that are being tried in the U.S., the money printing and the stimulus programs and the Keynesian solutions, are not working. What do you make of Paul Krugman recently writing in the New York Times suggesting that, well, if aliens invaded the world or America, that the policymakers would get united enough to combat the aliens by deficit spending, by borrowing another few $1 trillion to fight the aliens, and this is what's needed to stimulate the U.S. economy. Was he using a metaphor? Is he insane? Is he corrupt? Or is he just plain silly?
I think he's just plain silly. You know, fighting for survival is a different thing from having an economy that works. And what Krugman's real point is, and also Robert Reich, they make the same point, is that, look, if the deficits were bigger, we would come out of this. But there's no evidence for that. It just shows two people who have not grown out of the post-World War II Keynesian demand management model. In their thinking, there's no offshoring. We don't have 22% unemployment because so many jobs have been moved offshore. We have 22% unemployment because the deficit's not big enough. Well, that's silly. That's in denial of reality. Now, I think the reason they take that position is they're afraid to criticize jobs offshoring because offshoring is confused by most economists with free trade. And most economists are scared to death to criticize free trade because they'll be read out of the profession as quacks. So they're unable then to see what the real problem is.
Okay, so you've got basically on the rhetorical side of things the confusion between jobs offshoring and free trade. And of course, the U.S. likes to think of itself as a free trader. Therefore, they turn a blind eye to jobs offshoring, even though what this means is that the basic integrity of the jobs market itself, as represented by wages, as represented by savings, has been completely obliterated. Don't people understand that if you don't have people with real wages in the United States who can save real money, that you don't have the capital to form the basis of your so-called capitalist economy?
Well, some do, but many don't. And what they don't understand is that if the jobs are offshored, you don't have the consumer demand to support the economy or to support the growth. And if the jobs are offshored, you can't call people back to work by having bigger deficits and easier money. So that's what they don't really get. Look, just the other day, the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank published a study, and it was designed to poo-poo any concern with jobs offshoring, especially to China. What the study said was that, look, imports from China are only 2.7% of total disposable income of consumers or consumer expenditures. Well, as I pointed out, how big is the planet Earth? It's large compared to the moon. It's not very large compared to the solar system, and it's infinitesimal when compared to the universe. And so if you're going to make that kind of comparison, you have to compare Chinese imports with what Americans spend on that type of product. And if you do that, you find out the figure's 10 times larger than the Federal Reserve Bank told us. In other words, they were comparing the Earth to the universe rather than to an appropriate classification. So there is then on the part of policymakers themselves an effort to obscure the tremendous cost, job-wise, tax-wise, consumer income-wise, of offshoring. And it continues. I've exposed a number of these efforts to simply make a non-issue out of the offshoring, but they continue.
All right, let me ask you a practical, nitty-gritty, case-specific question. Let's take a look at Apple Computer for a second. They manufacture in China. The cost of the parts and service for an iPhone is approximately $150. They sell that unit for approximately $450. The company, Apple Computer, either the first or second largest company by capitalization in the world, has approximately $70 billion in cash on their balance sheet sitting there doing nothing. They don't make acquisitions with it. It just collects dust. If they brought those jobs home to America and used that $70 billion, they would not have to raise the price of their products, would they?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, because if Apple tried to say, look, we want to only employ Americans, or mainly Americans, and we want to produce here, they would come under, first of all, their stock price would drop dramatically. Shareholders would scream. There would be takeover attempts. Wall Street would come down on them like a ton of bricks. It's not like the executives can make these decisions on their own. They get coerced by Wall Street, by stock analysts. They get coerced by takeover threats, shareholders. And so, I'm not trying to make an excuse for it. I'm just trying to show the complexity of it. It's even if you don't want to go offshore, you'll be forced. Suppose you're a supplier to Walmart. They simply tell you, meet the Chinese price, or we'll go somewhere else. So it's very difficult under the present arrangements for a company to refuse to offshore production for the American market because it drops the labor costs so much, the profits go up so much. I mean, look at Apple's stock. It's up close to $400. I remember some years ago it was 15 and Business Week was saying the company was going to fail.
Let me ask you, we had about 1 minute left. Now, across Europe and in America, the speed of asset and wealth grabbing by the rich, including the Apple people, from the poor seems to be accelerating rapidly. So is this acceleration rate going to pick up until we just enter a new dark ages, as some are talking about, or was there anything going to get in the way of this freight train of neo-feudalism?
Well, the only thing that could get in the way of it would be revolt. The people were in the streets.
Well, forget that, because Americans are too addled on drugs and cheap television shows to bother with that. So don't wake them up. They're busy, playing with their Apple computers. So you're telling me, if that's the recourse, then I guess we're heading back into the dark ages, is what you're saying.
Well, we're heading back into a situation, as we said at the beginning, where wealth is being reconcentrated at the top. It's going to be like feudalism. Very few, very rich people, nobody else with very much at all. And there doesn't seem to be much economic prospects out of that. And given the debt levels, not just the United States, but throughout the West, this implies failure of the system. It implies some kind of massive failure of the system. Just because you're rich doesn't mean you can survive if the system itself fails.
Yes, I believe that has been well documented throughout history and in Shakespearean tragedies, hubris, or the Icarus flying to the sun. I mean, of course, this has to all be relearned again. That's all the time for we have, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Thanks again for being on the edge.
Thank you, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge with me, Max Keiser. I want to thank my guest, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. If you want to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.